As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
I'm sure that, most of you have heard about the head of the Wagner Group, the Russian private military company, the mercenary force, launched some sort of insurrection on Friday, and it was, again, very short-lived. So just a brief synopsis of it before I go over this story. On Friday, it started with Prigozhin and accusing Russia of bombing his Wagner mercenary force. There was some video that was put out on Telegram, but, there's no way that you could really tell what happened, if it was Russian airstrikes that hit this area or what. And then he released a video and went on, one of his big tirades against Russian military leadership that have become kind of common now. But then, these Wagner forces entered Russia from, Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine, and they took control of a military base in Rostov-on-Don, which is the capital of the Rostov Oblast, which borders Ukraine. And then they started marching towards Moscow. There were reports of some clashes between Wagner fighters and Russian forces. Those aren't really confirmed, but it was a very hectic, 2 days in Russia on Friday and Saturday. And then on Saturday, they reached some sort of deal, and Prigozhin, turned his men around and they went back to their bases. So again, there was so much, I think, bad information flying around on the internet, especially on Twitter, about what was really going on here. But it was just a very hectic, news cycle. So Russia's Wagner Group has called off its march on Moscow and agreed to stand down after launching a 2-day mutiny and seizing a military base in the city of Rostov-on-Don. The Kremlin said that it would drop all charges against the company and its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who has been guaranteed safe passage to Belarus. So Prigozhin shared a brief audio statement to social media on Saturday, confirming his decision to withdraw, saying that the PMC would return to its field camps and continue their previous operations in Ukraine. So PMC stands for Private Military Company. So Prigozhin said, quote, "They wanted to disband PMC Wagner on June 23rd. We went on a march of justice in a day. We advanced on Moscow just 200 kilometers short, and during this time, we did not shed a single drop of the blood of our fighters," end quote. So earlier on Saturday, he announced that they captured the Southern Military District headquarters in Rostov less than 1 day after accusing the Russian military of launching a missile strike on a Wagner position and vowing to take his complaints directly to the Kremlin. So he harshly criticized the leadership of Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, demanding his resignation, along with the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov, and he is basically the head of the war effort. And Shoigu, again, is the defense minister, and for a while now, he's been really critical of these two. When he was putting out those videos, accusing the Russian military of not providing his fighters with enough ammunition during Bakhmut. This is who he was signaling out. So while the full extent of the mutiny remains unclear, unverified videos making the rounds online purported to show active clashes between Wagner and Russian regulars. A Reuters correspondent also said they witnessed a military helicopter firing on a mercenary column driving near the city of Voronezh, about halfway to Moscow from Rostov, but noted that the fighters faced little substantial resistance on the road. So I'm not sure if there was any casualties or what. I was really looking, and it's been hard to find. Again, I saw lots of claims, on social media, but nothing really verified. Next one here, Blinken on Russia crisis. We haven't seen the last act. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken suggested on Sunday that the U.S. was expecting more unrest in Russia following Yevgeny Prigozhin's 2-day uprising. So Blinken told CBS News on Sunday, quote, "I think we're in the midst of a moving picture. We haven't seen the last act. We're watching it very closely and carefully," end quote. So when asked if the U.S. was in touch with Russia about the crisis, Blinken said that he instructed his team to engage with Russia to ensure that they understood their responsibilities in terms of protecting U.S. personnel. So there's no sign, Blinken, there's no sign that he attempted to speak with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, about the incident. He's basically refused to speak with Lavrov at all since the Russian invasion. They've only spoken like 2 or 3 times, I believe. And one time was like a brief 10-minute chat on the sidelines of a G20 conference. So he's just completely abandoned diplomacy with Russia. All right, so moving past the Prigozhin stuff, the next story here, the Pentagon says that cluster bombs are useful for Ukraine. So a Pentagon official has told Congress that controversial cluster munitions Ukraine has been seeking from the U.S. would be useful to Ukrainian forces on the battlefield. Cluster bombs scatter small submunitions, or bomblets as they call them, over large areas, making them especially hazardous to civilians. Because of their indiscriminate nature, cluster munitions have been banned by more than 100 nations. But the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia are not parties to the treaty known as the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Both sides in the current conflict in Ukraine have reportedly used cluster bombs in the fighting. Both sides are accused of it. And Kiev, the Ukrainian government, was using them against populated areas of Donetsk in the Donbass war, going back to 2014.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
But there's been a lot of scandalous Biden stuff that's been coming out over the last couple days. We've been reporting it on all of it. Some of the biggest bombshells is this year. We'll just recap real quick because we've done a lot of this, but we're going to recap some of the biggest bombshells. So you had the FBI always knew that the Hunter Biden laptop was validated and real. At the same time, they took the information off the internet and they wrote, they hit up the intelligence agencies and said, hey, we're going to need you guys going to call this Russian misinformation. They were able to do it. They removed it from the internet. The Department of Justice, when Joe Biden starts to run, they say, hey, you can't look into any of these bribe things, and they limit the scope of the investigation of Hunter Biden. They stall it, and they make sure that it's not looking into Joe Biden. You get all of these really interesting storylines of Joe Biden being the big guy, Hunter Biden being in the same house as Joe Biden, from what I understand, and going, hey, I'm sitting here with the big guy. Where are my payments? You promised us some money. You got all this stuff going on, and usually CNN, they're not reporting on any of this. So I saw this tweet. It was linked into a Zero Hedge article. I will read it for you guys. But this was, even CNN is now going for President Biden on the Hunter Biden whistleblower criminal allegation leaks. Looks like below options 1 and 2 have now been initiated. Globalists now seek Biden out on health grounds, Hunter out with him faded into obscurity after his plea deal, Trump locked up or disqualified, RFK Jr. marginalized like Bernie Sanders, and Gavin Newsom versus Ron DeSantis presidential race. So this was interesting. CNN was actually reporting on the whistleblower claims against the AG for not allowing them to, firstly, they were going to raid Biden's house, and that got squashed. And then they were going to investigate some of the bribery claims, and that got squashed. And so you start wondering, why is it that mainstream media is actually reporting on these incidents? Are they starting to actually turn on Joe Biden? And I thought that this was just a reasonable theory. I don't know that they'll be able to pull it off because you look at how Ron DeSantis is doing in the polls. It's not very well. But Gavin Newsom does seem to be the only person who's possibly even set up to replace Joe Biden. And I do think that if the deep state did have its way, they would love a Gavin Newsom versus Ron DeSantis because that's 2 players for the same team.
The Peter Schiff Show.
The reason that the United States is still the dominant economy is because the dollar is the reserve currency. I think while the dollar status was once a product or a byproduct of America's dominance, that dominance is now completely dependent on that status, because when the United States got that status, we used it like a crutch, and now we have been dependent on that crutch. It's what enabled us to outsource all of our manufacturing. And as the U.S. economy became less and less competitive due to regulations and taxes and things like that, rather than pushing back against the regulations and taxes, we were just able to run deficits and import the stuff that we couldn't produce because of the dollar's reserve status. So it's like, because we relied on that crutch, we became crippled and then needed the crutch. Because initially we didn't need it, but it was given to us. And so we decided to use it rather than just walk on our own 2 feet. But now we're so dependent on that crutch because the economy is, our legs have atrophied. We need it. And you take it away and everything's going to collapse. And it seems that Powell doesn't really understand that. The UK just came out with worse than expected inflation last week. I mean, I think like 8.5%. I mean, they've got a big problem there in the United Kingdom. And so they want to say, yeah, you see, it's not Biden's fault because, how could you blame him for, the inflation in the United Kingdom? And so Powell says, yes, looking around the world, it's obvious the one thing that all these countries have in common is COVID. And so because of COVID, that's why we have inflation, because of these supply chain bottlenecks. But of course, what Powell conveniently overlooks when he claims the one thing they have in common is COVID. No, what they have in common is the way they responded to COVID by creating inflation. That's what they have in common. They all printed a bunch of money because of COVID. They slashed interest rates because of COVID. They ran bigger budget deficits because of COVID. That's what they have in common. And it didn't start with COVID. All of these countries that are now experiencing elevated inflation, this is not an accident. It's because they all were pursuing inflationary monetary policies by design. Everybody, the UK, the Bank of England, or the ECB, the Bank of Japan, the Fed, what they all had in common is what they all said: we don't have enough inflation. Inflation is too low. They were all doing quantitative easing. They all had 0% or negative interest rates. Those are the mistakes that they all made in common. And that's why they're all suffering the same consequence, which is inflation. So inflation was manufactured by government and by central banks, both in the United States and in Europe, because the governments made the same mistakes on both sides of the Atlantic. On the Democratic side, they are trying to get Powell to comment on the budget deficits. We got the national debt, as I mentioned on my last podcast, above 32 trillion. We're going to make it a beeline now for 33 trillion. But the deficits are running out of control. And we have massive spending. And the Republicans are trying to get Powell to make the obvious connection between these deficits and inflation. Right? I mean, even Keynesians, who really don't even understand economics, should know that, right? That if you have excess fiscal stimulus, right, you have massive deficits, you're going to have inflation. You're stimulating demand. You're not stimulating supply. You're just creating more demand for a given supply. The price has got to go up, especially if the Fed is, printing the money to monetize those deficits. And Powell continues to claim that he's not allowed to do that. He's like, look, I can't go out of my lane. I'm responsible for monetary policy. I can't talk about fiscal policy. It's the same with all my predecessors. I mean, we just don't go there. It's not in our wheelhouse. We don't want to overstep our bounds. This is complete BS. I mean, I think that they're trying to flip on its head the idea that the government should allow the Fed to be independent, where Congress shouldn't be beating up on the Fed to print more money or cut rates, right? That the central bank should be independent. It doesn't work the other way around. We're not supposed to have an independent central bank so that it won't criticize the government. No. Part of the reason to have an independent central bank is precisely so it will criticize the government, because they are above politics, right? The central bankers supposedly don't have to get elected, so they can do what's in the public interest. And if congressmen who do need to get reelected are sacrificing the public's interest for political expediency, it's the job of an independent central bank to call out the reckless fiscal policy. And that is exactly the job that Powell is refusing to do. A, because he's a coward, and B, he's lying, because I went back and I actually tweeted some of this stuff out. When Paul Volcker was chairman of the Fed, and Powell has spoken fondly of Volcker and how Volcker, did a great job, and he beat down inflation and he restored credibility. It's like, Powell is supposedly, or Volcker is one of Powell's heroes. Well, if that's the case, Paul Volcker was a staunch critic of deficit spending, even under Reagan, because there were some big deficits under Reagan. I mean, not, by, today's terms. I mean, you're talking about budget deficits of, I don't know what it was, $150 billion a year. I mean, they're 10 times that size now. But these were big deficits back in the 80s. And Volcker was very critical of these deficits. He said, you got to do something. You got to cut government spending or raise taxes. But he was specific, and he gave speeches to and called on Congress to cut defense spending, specifically cut defense, cut entitlements, cut Social Security, cut Medicare. This is what Volcker was telling Congress to do. And he said, you got to do this. Otherwise, we're going to have more inflation. It's going to put upward pressure on long-term interest rates. It's going to hurt the economy. You've got to get the fiscal house in order. You got to cut spending. Now, he was the Fed chairman. He had no problem not only commenting on fiscal policy, but directly criticizing fiscal policy and giving Congress advice as to what he thought they should be doing to correct the mistakes that he was pointing out. And he was trying to fight inflation, and he's pointing out, hey, I'm trying to put out the fire. You guys keep lighting fires. Give me a little help here, right? That's what Powell is supposed to be doing. If he's supposed to be fighting inflation, he should be lecturing Congress to stop lighting the fires that he claims to be trying to put out. When you have a Fed chairman being asked by so many congressional representatives, give us your opinion. We want to know what you think of these deficits. And he says, I can't tell you. I'm not allowed. Based on what law? Because if if Volcker was allowed, if Greenspan was allowed, and if Congress hasn't passed any legislation that would somehow inhibit the Fed from commenting on fiscal policy, then why can't he do it? The reason is he's copping out. He doesn't want to comment because he doesn't want to put these politicians in the spot and call them out. But that's exactly what he needs to do. And the fact that he won't do it, that is more proof that we don't have an independent central bank. He's trying to claim, the central bank is independent, so we won't criticize Congress. No. If the central bank was independent, they would be criticizing Congress. And finally, I want to point out a comment that Senator Warren made at the very end of it, Elizabeth Warren. And she was really just taking Powell to task because of all this deregulation that he supposedly favored. And Warren is blaming all the problems that we have now in the banking system on the fact that Powell wanted to deregulate, that we just took away too much government regulation. And now we have this broken financial system. And Powell broke it through deregulation. And that's why she didn't approve of his reappointment, was because of all this deregulation that he was in favor of that has now wrecked the banking system. Well, the only thing that Elizabeth Warren got right is that the banking system is broken. She's right about that. But she is completely wrong about who broke it. She helped broke it. The government broke it. The Fed broke it. Not because it took regulations away, but because it put regulations there in the first place. It didn't take enough regulations away. It's like they can pass like a dozen regulations, and then maybe they roll back one or two. And then they say, aha, you see, look, you roll back these one or two regulations. That's what caused the problem. No, the problem was caused by the 10 regulations they didn't roll back. They left those in place. It is the government that screwed up the banking industry. It's one of the most highly regulated and subsidized industries in the country. That's why it's one of the most screwed up. The way you get a sound industry that doesn't have all kinds of imbalances, that doesn't have all kinds of excessive risk-taking, is to leave it alone, is to let the free market function. That is the best way. That is the only way to have a sound market, because that way people are responsible for the consequences of their own bad decisions. And that is the check that you need to balance everything out. Yes, people are greedy and they want to make money, but they also don't want to lose money. That's part of greed too, not wanting to lose money. And what the government does is they come in and they pass all these regulations to make people think it's impossible to lose money. They don't care about losing money. And that's what lets the greed run amok, because it's no longer checked by the fear. The free market provides both greed and fear. And there's a healthy balance because people are dealing with their own money. See, the problem with politicians is none of it is their own money. It's all somebody else's money. So they don't give a damn, right? They just care about their own reelection. They don't care about the real economic consequences. So what we need is to get rid of government. We need to get the government out of banking, and so we can get the free market back in.
Russia's Academy Award-winning performance for Best Coup. Prigozhin scores Best Actor. So that kind of gives you a flavor of where he's going. And if you go to the next one, here's just a couple of points, and I won't read these all. I know that's bleary-eye making, but it's interesting. First of all, I made this point that the Wagner Group was founded and established by Russian intelligence, so it's not a private Prigozhin company. Prigozhin has been shooting his mouth off for months, spouting threats against the Russian military and indirectly at Putin, but the rest of NATO considers Putin and his government as a dictatorship. And Larry Johnson makes the point. Does this mean Russia's not a dictatorship? He wasn't arrested or sanctioned for all the time he's been mouthing off against his own commander-in-chief. So in the other things I've mentioned, the Russian government waited about 12 hours before sending the police and military forces to the Wagner Group headquarters in St. Petersburg. There seemed to be very little sense of urgency. He Prigozhin ordered a column of Wagner troops to go from Rostov to Moscow to dethrone Shoigu and General Gerasimov let's take a look at the map, and I won't put the map up. He said, that's a distance of, as I said, almost 1,200 kilometers. How is it that a column of trucks and tanks is supposed to refuel and cover that distance in less than 20 hours?
Neocon image and the control and the authority that they have here in this country is pretty bold.
Yeah.
When you think the neocons are in charge of the budget for the military, they're in charge of the policy, and they're able to control it. And even though there's noise between the Republicans and Democrats, I think we might even point out where some of the Republicans are very supportive of all this militancy. And it used to be the Republicans were more than the Democrats. Then the Democrats all of a sudden got militant. Now it's worse. It's bipartisan. There's too many Republicans and Democrats are for the military activity around the world and protecting our empire.
Yeah. One little funny thing that on the side of this whole thing is because, the U.S. government has labeled Prigozhin and Wagner as terrorists, a terrorist organization. We've got to get rid of them, sanction them. Look, this next one. This is the Wall Street Journal. This is what they did in the midst of the coup when the U.S. government thought a coup was actually happening. U.S. to delay sanctions on Wagner for fear of siding with Putin. So all of a sudden they became the good guys in the middle of this whole thing. So I thought that was kind of funny.
I have a short story. It may not make you laugh, but you might smile and you might comment. But this is, I thought, good news. Politico. I read and look at Politico because we've used them.
Yeah.
On occasion, they come up with the right issue. Now, the headline is pretty good. Hunter Biden got special treatment, with his penalties, the convictions he had. He was convicted of 2 crimes.
Yeah.
And, but it turns out why they think it's special treatment is that he was overly punished. He had 2 misdemeanors, and they said most people with these misdemeanors, taxes and guns, nobody goes to jail over that. But here they go, they pick the president's son on these minor misdemeanor charges, and he's treated like this. He's not treated like a dignitary or somebody special, and they call it especially harsh treatment. But here it is. Here the conservatives are right on this, attacking the Department of Justice and the FBI, because they are getting special treatment. Yes, there's special treatment, but it's upside down. It's exactly opposite reason for this. I thought that was a little bit entertaining.